This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Hey, former Congressman Joe Walsh. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh, where every week your favorite one-time divisive politician sits down with someone who doesn't think like me because I worry about how divided this country is. I am so excited to talk to my guest today because, as you know, I feel very passionately about what's going on in the Middle East right now. Dr. Farid Senzai is the founder and president of Afghan Relief. Dr. Senzai is also a professor of poli-sci and international relations at a great school, good Jesuit school, Santa Clara University, where he teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East politics. I'm not done. Prior to starting Afghan Relief, Dr. Senzai was the founder and president of the Center for Global Policy, a think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on U.S. relations with the Muslim world. He was previously a co-founder and the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where he conducted extensive research projects on Muslims in America. Prior to that, he was a research associate at a great place, the Brookings Institution, and a research analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's on the board of advisors at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and a former board member at the Central Asia Institute. I'm almost done. Dr. Senzai received his Master's of Arts in International Affairs from Columbia University and PhD in Politics and International Relations from Oxford University. I feel like I want to call you Mr. President. I feel like I wish you were President of the United States of America. Farid, welcome. And first off, I just want to say thank you. And I give you credit for launching this conversation because, as you know, I feel very passionately about Israel, and I'm sure I've stepped in it a bunch of times in the last 2 months. And I remember tweeting something a couple weeks ago, and you very respectfully tweeted me back and said, "Come on, knucklehead." You didn't say knucklehead. This issue is more nuanced than what you're saying. I wanted to bring you on to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. I wanted your perspective. I'm sure we disagree on a bunch, but thank you, my friend, for joining me.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. I've always admired you, your sort of conviction on the views that you have. I've followed you on social media as well as the interviews you've done on TV. And so, it is an honor for me to be able to talk to you directly. I feel like, as you said, these issues in the Middle East are topics that can be very divisive and and without nuance, we don't really sort of understand the whole context of what's happening. And so anytime somebody says something that's a little bit too strident or black and white, I generally try to respond to that.
Well, and I loved it, and you did, and I respected that. And then we said, let's sit down and talk, because that's the whole point of my podcast. I want to get in a little bit too, because I think the situation is much more simple than people think. But let's start here, my friend. Here we are now, December, what's the date today? December 21st.
That's right.
70 some days removed from October 7th. I'm going to ask a stupidly broad question to get us going. How did we get here? How did we get here 74 days later? I know what happened. You know what happened October 7th. But how did this thing start?
Well, there's a certain assumption that as if everything did start on October 7th, that October 7th is a date many people look at. For someone like me who's been studying this region and this topic for more than 2 decades, what happened on October 7th did not surprise me at all. In fact, it was expected. Many people who understand this understood that this type of attack, that an attack against Israel was likely to happen. All the ingredients were there for something like this to happen. What surprised me, and
were you surprised that Israel kind of fell asleep?
What surprised me was the way that it happened, the fact that Israel did not anticipated, and then of course the scale of the attack in terms of the number of civilians in Israel that were killed, that part of it surprised me. And so it wasn't that the attack happened, it was the scale of what actually was inflicted on Israel. That part surprised me, because considering what Gaza is in terms of its abilities or capabilities, one would not have expected that they would have been able to mount an attack of that scale, or at least with that level of sophistication as they did. That part of it surprised me.
And what's interesting, Farid, is this is decades in coming. This conflict, this war has been going on for decades. And yet, and help me with this, Israelis now look at October 7th as almost their 9/11.
That's right.
Because it was so profound and so extensive, the number of civilians.
Absolutely. That's how they see it. And, just as we responded to September 11th when George W. Bush was president, the U.S. came together, unified, and wanted to respond, to say, how could we have been attacked? How could this have happened? And then we went out and started our war on terrorism, which then, of course, we saw lasted for more than 2 decades, both in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. We've continued that effort. And in some ways, there's a lesson to be learned from that experience. And we can talk about that in more detail. But Israel also saw this as their 9/11, to say, how could this have happened? How could we have been attacked like this? Israel had never been attacked since its founding. It had always had wars, and there have been many wars, but it's always been on other countries' territory. This was a direct attack against Israel, and that part of it shocked Israel, and therefore the country unified around the prime minister to respond. And that's exactly what happened. But the real question is, how should Israel have responded, or should Israel have expected this? And I'm saying that they should not be surprised that it happened.
They should not be surprised, though you're not trying to justify or make any maybe you are, some sort of rationale for what Hamas did, though you're probably not justifying it. Right?
Absolutely. No one can justify the actions of Hamas in terms of its brutality, in terms of its attacks against innocent civilians.
Yeah.
None of that can be justified. I mean, under any grounds, that type of attack cannot be justified. Killing innocent civilians is absolutely unacceptable. It's atrocious in terms of what took place on October 7th. But one has to understand where that anger comes from. What leads one to decide to join a group, first of all, like Hamas, and then what leads a group like Hamas to decide to mount an attack like that against Israel? That has to be understood. And unless one understands the motivations of why that happens, the response ends up being problematic. And in Israel, then, not looking at the context of where that came from, or knowing or focusing on the history, and we as outsiders looking at it, not focusing on the context of where that comes from, we misjudge it. We then implement policies which are misguided. No different than what happened after 9/11, if we use that analogy, that not understanding the context of Afghanistan or Iraq, and then where that animosity came from to lead to the 9/11 attacks against the United States, we then engaged in a way that was not really constructive. And we then fought this war on terrorism, which led to tremendous devastation, cost in human life, as well as cost, in terms of treasure. All of that. What happened in the end of 20 plus years? The Taliban that we removed from power come back to power. So, and someone like me who had been looking at this, I remember an interview I did soon after September 11th in 2001, in which I was asked, should the U.S. fight this war against Afghanistan to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? And I said, we have to be very careful about how we do this. But in fact, going into Afghanistan is a mistake in terms of the way we're going about this war. And most likely it will end up in not being successful. I said that then. And 20 years later, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and Farid, you and I actually would have agreed on a lot of that.
Yes.
There's no doubt that when we were hit on 9/11, we went way too far and made a bunch of bad decisions. We had no business invading Iraq. We had no business being in Afghanistan for 20 years. We had to respond.
Yes.
And then I then think about Israel and their hit, and I agree with Israel in this regard, Farid, that it's a game changer that Hamas has to go. Okay, so how do you do that? And as you know, Gaza is such a unique situation. Hamas is embedded in their civilian infrastructure and all the rest, but they have to respond. But Farid, it seems like such an unfair position they've been put in, because no matter how they respond, they're going to create more animosity and terrorists.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So then what, and I know you're probably no Bibi fan. I'm tired of Bibi. Bibi's been there too damn long. If you had Bibi in a room 2 days after October 7th, just the two of you, how would you have told him to respond? I know it's a hard question.
No, it's actually a fairly straightforward question. I mean, it would be the same way that I would respond to President George W. Bush when he decided to go after September 11th.
So start there, Farid. If you had W in a room after 9/11, how would you have told him to respond?
I went to Washington numerous times, had meetings with people in the State Department, including White House officials, and I said that there is no military solution to Afghanistan. That this really has to be, while military can be part of it, but military has to be very, very precise in terms of how you go after Al-Qaeda, not in fact after the Taliban. And even the Taliban and Al-Qaeda need to be separated. You deal with them separately. You deal with them in a very different way. You can't lump them together. And therefore you go in that way, but ultimately it's about a political solution for what needs to happen in Afghanistan. The same, I would say.
A targeted military piece has to be
very, very precise, targeted, going after Al-Qaeda. There were only 3,000 members of Al-Qaeda. What we did was we lumped Al-Qaeda, these 3,000 individuals that are part of Al-Qaeda, with the Taliban, which was supported by a vast segment of the Afghan population, even though they started to lose support and was waning by 2001, but still there was a segment of the population that supported them. And the question was, how do you politically engage with the Taliban while then going after Al-Qaeda and separating the two and being much more clear about how you fight this war on terror?
Well, and Farid, Dick Cheney wanted to remake the Middle East, and we had no business doing that. So let's bring it back to Israel.
Yes.
A targeted military has to be a part of this. Do you agree with me that if you're Israel, if Bibi said to you, I'm going to take Hamas out, we have to do that. Do you agree that that's a worthy goal?
Militarily going in after Hamas will only strengthen Hamas, which is precisely what has happened. Right now, a poll was just taken by one of the leading polling centers in the West Bank, led by Khalil Shikaki, who's been doing this for decades. He did a poll in which he found that during that pause, when there was a temporary pause in the fighting, they did the poll. They went and asked people in the West Bank and in Gaza. Hamas's support has gone up to 75% nearly. Nearly 3/4 of the population of Palestinians support Hamas. So what has happened? So rather than weakening Hamas's support, rather than weakening the organization, in fact, it has done the opposite.
But then, Farid, and correct me if I'm wrong, I agree with that polling, and that surprised a lot of Americans. Prior to October 7th, the polling I always saw was that generally Hamas garnered more than 50% support among Palestinians in Gaza. They're also popular in the West Bank. So there's always been strong support for Hamas.
And the
You're
support,
right, though. It
and
did
the
get
support,
stronger.
and
Go
the
ahead.
support in the West Bank went up more
Yes.
than the support from Gaza for Hamas. Which then that in itself, think about it, that West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas. The Gaza is ruled by Hamas, but yet support in the West Bank went up for Hamas after the attacks. Why is that? Is because what happened is that Palestinians as a society unified and came together around Hamas after the attacks.
Well,
So did in fact the attacks against Hamas diminish its popularity? No, in fact the opposite happened. And so what was the outcome for
Farid, isn't that fairly common in times of war?
Yes.
That a country's populace, I mean, that happens in America.
Yes.
Everybody rallied behind W after 9/11. I mean, so that to a degree that does happen all the time.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Why did all Israelis come and unify around Bibi, even though
Bingo.
Israel was so divided in terms of its internal politics? You saw all the protests for months and months. Israelis were out there protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu. And then what happened? It was after the attacks, they came together. So you're absolutely right that societies do come together when they feel they're under attack. That's exactly what happened in Gaza. And so therefore, Benjamin Netanyahu, with his aim to in fact weaken Hamas, through those attacks, what happened? It only strengthened Hamas and brought even the West Bank Palestinians to rally
Okay.
along Hamas. And so
Okay,
what
Mr.
Hamas,
Expert.
yes, Hamas is now
Okay,
in fact much stronger today than before. So what advice would you give? Precisely not to do what Benjamin Netanyahu did.
Then okay, my favorite expert. Then what would you have told him to do?
Look, ultimately, as I've always said, that unless a political solution is brought in which Palestinians are given hope that they in fact have freedom, that they have the possibility for self-determination, that they have the possibility to determine their own outcome and their future, unless that happens, they will continually then resort to armed resistance. In fact, on the question of armed resistance, when asked, that number also dramatically increased. People who were against armed resistance then said, no, in fact, armed resistance should be supported, and what Hamas is doing in terms of armed resistance should be supported. So that's what happened. When you take hope away from people and you take the possibility of peaceful, armed approach to it, they will support it. But if you take that away from them, they will resort to armed resistance.
Farid, I agree with you that there's a reason why Hamas did what they did.
Yes.
And we in America are very bad at trying to understand that. I'm very pro-Israel. Most very pro-Israel people say, fuck it, Joe, I don't care why they did it. That was evil that day. We got to kill them.
Yes.
So I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm Israel, and I need to balance that, understanding why there's this pent-up rage for years and decades, and it comes out on October 7th, but I have to respond. Militarily has to be a piece of this.
Has to be a piece.
Right?
Has to be a piece, but a very carefully executed piece.
What is that then? What is that, Farid? What is that carefully executed?
Look, it's about finding specific individuals that may have been part of the planning, and therefore, yes, targeting individuals that were part of that effort to plan, execute the attacks. That's fine. And therefore, just like Al-Qaeda, going after Osama bin Laden, individuals that planned the attacks on September 11th against the United States. That's being much more precise. And therefore, just like a surgeon, you go in, you use a very precise instrument in order to cut out or remove a cancer. You don't use a sledgehammer in which you destroy the entire body with the aim to get rid of a cancer which is in part of the body. The same thing here, that Israel is using a sledgehammer against the Palestinian people, and in the process, you're angering millions of Palestinians that in fact would love nothing more than in fact to find some peaceful resolution to then get rid of and lose support for Hamas, because many don't in fact historically had not supported Hamas. Hamas garners support when the approach is seen as unjustified and used in sort of overly military response to it. That's only going to garner more support for groups like Hamas.
There are very rare examples of, in history, military history, of the approach you would recommend, a very specific, targeted, with a tiny little scalpel, and it sounds like no bombing at all, no targeted bombing at all. You bring in special forces or whatever, but eventually that means Israeli troops on the ground in Gaza trying to hunt down these terrorists. And you know better than I the elaborate tunnel system there. I'll tell you what, Farid, that sounds like Mission Impossible to me, and that sounds like a lot of IDF soldiers dying over the next 10 years on this very targeted mission. I get that. I mean, generally, militarily, you bomb to soften the target, and then you bring the troops in. This is an urban environment where, as you know, Hamas has made their terror infrastructure and their civilian infrastructure one and the same. It's kind of Mission Impossible, isn't it?
Well, that's if you assume that that is ultimately the aim. You have to sort of step back and look at it and say, how did we end up here? Which is where you started your question.
Yeah.
Like, how did we get here? The reason we got here is because of this long history, which most Americans don't understand. Most
Right.
Americans don't know the history of like what led to getting to this point, what led to the fact that we even have a Gaza, what led to the fact that we have a Hamas. None of that is understood by most Americans. And
Agreed.
therefore, without knowing that history, then you actually are not dealing with the root causes. The goal is to ultimately deal with the root causes of how did we get here. That then helps us understand the complexity of the problem and then address the problem in the most appropriate way without, in fact, because right now, even what you're suggesting is still about like, how does Israel go into Gaza and sort of this urban warfare?
Right.
And that's not, in fact, what I'm suggesting. I'm saying that the problem has to be looked at much more broadly, to look at it historically. That history is complex. That history needs to be understood. And then knowing that, then you say, okay, now let's look at how do we deal with what we face in terms of between Israelis and Palestinians.
Farid, I agree. I agree completely that both sides need to step off of the track they're on.
Yes.
The daily, hourly fight that they're engaged in. They both need to step off that and think about, where are we? How did we get here? What are we going to do? Completely agree. That's very difficult to do, especially when October 7th happens. Like, I could see Israel then saying, okay, I need to understand why Hamas just did what they did. So we're not going to respond. We're going to call a summit to talk with Hamas because we want to know why they felt so aggrieved to come invade our country. I'm kind of being sarcastic, but I recognize your point. Eventually, they're going to have to do that. It's just hard to do now when you were hit like that.
Agreed. The problem is, and that anger is there. I mean, I have plenty of friends, including colleagues at my university, that are, some even, in fact, Israeli citizens. And so these individuals feel like, look, they have to respond. But exactly what Americans felt after September 11th, we have to respond. That's the initial desire and urgency to want to respond. But if your response leads to longer term problems, then in fact you're not addressing the problem. You're just making it much worse. It's about sort of thinking it through to say, how do I respond? Why in fact did this happen? And then dealing with it in a much more concerted and strategic and smart, intelligent way. Unless we do that, we in fact make the problem much, much worse. And that's what I'm worried about.
So let's you and I then, let's broaden this.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a stupid question that you probably will hate, but I'm going to ask it and I'll answer it first just to get you to respond.
Sure.
We'll go back to 1947, 48, 75 years, whatever. We can go back before then.
Let's
if you
go back
want.
100 years. Sure.
Let's go back 100 years.
Yeah.
Who's to blame? Let's look at the whole history. I'm going to ask you who's to blame. I'll answer it first.
Go ahead.
Just to begin our conversation.
Sure.
Who's to blame, big picture, for where we are in the Middle East? I will say both sides, but I will put more of the blame on the Palestinian side because, and then you're going to take it away, this is basically a conflict over land. And generally over the last 75 some years, since 47, 48, generally the Palestinians have rejected any sort of split, divvying up of the land. And the Palestinians generally don't believe, because they're so pissed off, rightly, about what happened in 47 and 48, they do not believe Israel has a right to exist. And so I think they get the lion's share of blame, though both sides get blame. But take it away, my expert.
Okay. So Joe, you want to bear with me, okay?
Oh, take your time.
Okay, great. So let me give you a sort of a bit of broader, sort of 100-year plus history.
Yeah.
In this, now there are two narratives to this story. There's a Jewish narrative in terms of the connection to this land, this historic connection to this land. Jews have always felt that they have always been connected to this land, that they for thousands of years had been connected to this land. They were dispersed over centuries, many, many centuries all over. And therefore there were Jews in Europe, there's Jews all over the Arab Middle East, and so you had Jews in Morocco, Jews in North Africa like Tunisia and Egypt, you had Jews in Iraq, you had Jews in Iran, you name it. There were Jews everywhere, but they'd been dispersed because they'd had a historic connection. They go all the way back 2,000 to 3,000 years that this connection had been there. That's absolutely true, that in fact connection is there, that religious connection for Jews is there, absolutely. But the number of Jews in the year 1800 was 3,000. Okay? There were 3,000 Jews in this land, historically Palestine, what was under the Ottoman Empire. It was referred to as historic Palestine. There were 3,000 Jews. They were only about 3 to 5% of the population, and therefore 95 to 97% of the population were Palestinian Arabs, both Muslims and Christian. 90% of them were Muslims, 10% of them are Christian Palestinians. And therefore, imagine a land in which the majority of the population, as I said, not even a small majority, but 95 to 97% of the population is Palestinian Arabs. And then even 100 years later, that number went up a slight bit. The number of Jews from 3,000 went up to 30,000. But still, the majority of the population, 600,000 to 700,000 of those, were still Arabs, mostly Muslim, but a smaller minority Christian Palestinian Arabs. Now, the majority of Jews, of course, were in Europe, in Eastern Europe, places like Hungary or Russia, the majority in Russia, for instance, or in Poland. The animosity and anti-Semitism that's taking root in Europe was part of the desire for Jews to say, we must return to our ancestral homeland, a place that we feel connected to. And therefore, over this animosity, because of the animosity, this desire to come back to Palestine, they considered other places. I mean, Uganda was considered, South Africa was considered, Argentina was considered, even the Sinai was considered. So many places were considered, but the majority felt we have this 2,000 to 3,000 year connection to this land, and therefore the right of return of Jews to their ancestral home must be supported.
So they began to come back.
So they began to come back. And when they started to come back, there was a slogan that they used to use. And the slogan was, "A land without people for a people without land." And therefore, that was the slogan that Zionists, as it took root in Eastern Europe, because they felt like, look, the anti-Semitism was so bad. This was Europeans in Hungary and in Poland and in Russia that were so and had such antipathy and such animosity towards Jews that they were killing them, creating programs, these ghettos that were ghettoizing Jews in Eastern Europe. Many of them tried to flee, in fact, to Western Europe. The British didn't want them. They tried even coming to the United States. Many were
Farid,
not.
correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
In addition to everything you're saying right now, Jews in other Arab lands in the region, because of violence and were being expelled, also were gravitating toward this.
No, absolutely not. Jews had been living for centuries and
I know that,
centuries
but-
all over the Arab world. And therefore, like for instance, I'll give you an example. My former professor at Oxford, Avi Schlein, professor, was an Iraqi Jew. He had been living there for decades. He was born and raised in Iraq. There were 125,000 Jews in Iraq that had been living there for 1,000 years. They had always lived peacefully in Iraq.
Right.
In fact, a third of the Baghdad population, a third of them were Jewish. And therefore, Jews had lived peacefully in Arab countries. In fact, in the 12th century, it was the French that forced all the Jews out. In the 13th century, Great Britain forced all the Jews out. In the 15th century, when the Inquisitions happened, Spain forced all the Jews out.
But I thought Middle Eastern Jews, though, at the beginning of the 20th century up through 47, were also experiencing violence and were being expelled from other Middle Eastern countries.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
okay.
It happened only after, in fact, Israel was starting to be established. And when Israel was established, then you began to see this, because nationalism for Israel then begins to take root after the establishment
in your mind,
of Israel.
then, Farid, why is Israel established in 47, 48? Why is Israel established?
Well, Israel is established because Jews, as I said, felt they needed a place that they could feel safe, that they needed a homeland for themselves. Because of the animosity that's taking place in Europe, they never felt they could fully assimilate. Even Theodor Herzl, who was the founder and wrote the Jewish State, was the founder of Zionism, he felt that Jews would never fully be accepted and welcome in European societies. And therefore, they needed a safe place, a state of their own. And therefore, Israel is established for that.
In your mind, was this an example of European colonialism?
It was absolutely an attempt by many Europeans, because of their own animosity towards Jews, forced the Jews out. Just like Hitler wanted the Jews out, guess what? Other Europeans wanted the Jews out. So for some, it was anti-Semitism to get rid of the Jews. And for the British, in fact, it was a combination of anti-Semitism, but also wanting a Western outpost in the Middle East because of the Suez Canal. Their main interest was India, and their desire to then have this canal open for trade. That was the strategic reason for having that.
Farid, by 47, 48, you've already got so much strife, violence, and chaos going on between Palestinians and Jews in Palestine that Europe then intercedes. I mean, it's not like they necessarily wanted to do this. It was becoming a real hotbed of violence.
Absolutely.
Because of the Jews that lived there.
But as I said, the population started to increase of Jews from Europe and elsewhere. As it started to increase, imagine if you're 97% of the population, and over these decades, now slowly these outsiders are coming in, settling in. Conflict erupts because of that, precisely because of that. And then, in fact, 750,000 Palestinians are forced out of villages. 400 to 500 villages are demolished, destroyed, in which we refer to as the Nakba, and the catastrophe in which ethnic cleansing happens. Now, imagine if that happened in the United States. Just sort of picture it, Joe. I ask you, if that happened in the United States, that let's say Mexico decided to forcefully or come and and take over parts of the United States. The UN backs it, and the UN then gives half of the United States, in fact 55% of the United States, to Mexico, and 45% to America, the United States, American citizens. Would you have accepted that if outsiders were seen as coming in?
So,
yes,
Farid, that's a great question. The answer is no. So, I guess then what I'm going to ask you is this.
who would have
Is
accepted that? No one would
then-
have accepted that.
What-
And so
what-
when you
well-
say Palestinians rejected it, they rejected it because nobody would have accepted the partition plan that took place in 1947, in which the UN then partitioned this land and said, you know what, they have to be divided, and gave 55% of the land to the minority
So then
and gave
what-
45% to the majority.
So then, Farid, then what then in your mind? You've got the Jewish population increasing, still a minority population.
Only a third by then. When Israel
You've got
established, it's
increasing.
a third.
You've got increasing violence and chaos between Jews and Palestinians.
Yes.
We feel, oh my God, something's got to be done. I ask you, is that really the crux of everything? Did something need to be done? Should Europe just have stayed out? Whatever happens on that piece of land happens. What in your mind should have been done at that point?
When you said who was to blame, ultimately the British are to blame. The British mandate, the British deciding on their authority, because there was the British Empire, that they had some right to in fact do this, that they in fact had the right to create this problem, and therefore the problem of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a British effort to bring these two together and to allow for this level of immigration to take place, so that you end up having this conflict. The seeds were planted prior to the establishment of the Israeli
Agreed,
state.
but then what then? Because the situation on the land wasn't going to change. So then what if the British didn't do what they did? What should have been done?
Well, the thing is that clearly, if you had the majority of the population being Palestinian, first of all, it should have all been part of Palestine, and Jews should have been welcomed in and become part of this Jewish state. It could have been one state. That, as I said, historically was the case. But the Zionists always realized that they wanted a state of their own, even though they constituted a minority of the population.
Farid, do you oppose the concept of a Jewish state on their own for the Jewish people?
Well, today, of course not. I'm saying they should have a state of their own. That absolutely, Israel has a right to exist, and has a right to, Jews have a right to a state of their own. Absolutely.
So back then, would you have partitioned things differently because the Jewish population was smaller? You would have given them a smaller piece?
Well, first of all, I would have never partitioned it at all. But if, in fact, it had been partitioned, you would have partitioned it based on the population. So let's say even in 1947, it would have been a third. So a third should have been given to the Jewish population, and 2/3 should have been given to the Palestinians. But think about it. If you're a Palestinian, even that's unacceptable. Just as you would yourself said, you wouldn't accept 2/3 of the United States if you had to give a third of it away just because Mexicans decide to come and say, we want a third of the United States. What American would have allowed that? Nobody would have allowed that. But I'm saying that, yes, in retrospect now, one can look back and say, yeah, the Palestinians should have accepted that, because they would have gotten, let's say, 2/3 of the land. They weren't offered 2/3. They were offered 45%. 55% was offered to the minority Jewish population. For sure, the Palestinians had a right to reject that, and
But
anyone in
at the
that position would have
At
rejected
the time,
it.
if you were around at the time,
Yeah.
the entire notion of carving out a Jewish state for this increasing Jewish population, you would not have done.
I would not have done. Absolutely not. Absolutely. But then guess what? This is what happened. Then the war between Israeli and Palestinian breaks out, which is the 47-48 war. When that happens, guess what happened? Because Israel had the support of the United States and the British, they had the military strength, the Palestinians did not. That territory of 55%, which was offered, turned into 78%, which then was left with the 22%, which is the West Bank and Gaza. That is what remained at the end of 1949, when the war was over. And therefore, the Jewish state, as it's recently then established in 48, They then take over 78% of the land, which we said
Well-
even the 55% was not acceptable, let alone now you've got 78%.
Again, so everybody understands, the partition is made, carve out the state of Israel.
Yeah.
The Arab Muslim world rejects it. They go to war. They initiate a war. Israel wins the war, and then Israel takes more property, more land, and then there's the 67 war, and Israel then takes, boom, more. But again, the 67 war, again, initiated by Arabs, Muslims. So, Farid, I'm going to accept your premise
Yeah.
that, and pardon my language, the Palestinians were screwed and fucked back in 47 and 48.
Yeah.
I will attest that I think my good expert friend is downplaying the animosity and violence over the course of 30 to 40 years before 47 growing between Jews and Palestinians. But let's put that aside for a moment.
Yes.
Here comes the British, partition the land. The Palestinians are pissed off about that. So for 75 years, they've tried to get back at that.
For 75 years, they have settled for, and willing to accept 22% of the land.
Oh.
22% of the land, which is the West Bank and the Gaza. That's 22%. And you know why they've accepted that? Because they have continually said, that's all we seek, 22% of the land. Palestinians overwhelmingly have come to the conclusion they will never get more than 22% of the land. 22% is all they've asked. And guess what? All of the Arab countries and all Muslim countries and the international community, everyone has agreed that the 22% is what should be offered along the 67 borders. That is what...
Let me ask you a question,
Yes.
Farid. Let me ask you a question. Why before the 67 war,
Yeah.
when Israel, again, Israel is attacked, Israel wins the war, Israel takes the West Bank and takes Gaza.
Yeah.
Prior to that,
Yeah.
Jordan ran the West Bank,
Yes.
correct? And Egypt had Gaza. What's wrong with just going back to that?
It would
Give
be great.
Jordan the West Bank, give Egypt Gaza. Done.
Well, because Jordan doesn't want it. Jordan
Why not?
Jordan temporarily was given that authority. Palestinians have always wanted their own sovereignty, their own independence, and Jordan would give it to them. That's the thing is, Palestinians want their own self-determination. They don't want to be ruled by Jordan, just as they don't want to be ruled by Egypt. And therefore,
But aren't there just a crap load of Palestinians in Jordan now? There always have been.
They always have been. But the thing is those are all refugees. Keep in mind that the majority of people after the war of 1948 led to refugees. Even in Gaza, we come back to Gaza, 70% of the population in Gaza are refugees from other parts of Palestine. They were forced from their homes when Israel was established as a state, and therefore, think about it, they have been forced once out of their homes that they've lived in, let's say for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years, and now they're refugees living in this miserable place called Gaza, which is an open-air prison, as it's often referred to. And now within
No
this...
thanks to Hamas. No thanks to Hamas.
But
No thanks to Hamas.
Hamas is a consequence of this occupation which has taken place. That is certainly the reason.
I'll fight you on that, but I don't want to get into that right now.
Okay.
But play this with me, Farid. From Israel's perspective, I don't trust... Hamas is a terrorist organization. I'm not going to live next to Hamas. Hezbollah up north, that we'll deal with that later. And I don't trust the Palestinian Authority. I'm not going to live next door to them. Jordan wants relationships with Israel. Egypt, better relationships with Israel. What if Israel came to Jordan and Egypt and just said, here's the solution. I'm tired of screwing around with Gaza and the West Bank. Jordan, it's yours. Egypt, it's yours. Let's go back to what it was before 67. Israel would be comfortable living next door to Jordan and Egypt.
First
Come
of all,
on. There you go.
You have the solution, Joe. You figured it all out.
But part of me likes that solution.
Well, the thing is, look, 20% of Israeli population is Palestinians. Do they live peacefully within Israel? Yes, they do. And therefore,
Yes, they do.
Yeah, exactly. So there's nothing inherently violent about Palestinians as a people. If 20% of Palestinians, of Israelis are Palestinians, so the fact is that Palestinians can live peacefully. They're Israeli citizens. So therefore, they're Israeli citizens who are fully
They
participating.
live in Israel.
Agreed. And the point is that Palestinians in the West Bank, if also given the right to determine, they're given freedom, given equality, given the right to self-determine their future, they too will not resort to violence and armed resistance. They certainly will not, because the majority of them want nothing more than that. They've never been offered that.
Farid, you got to give me this. I'm going to give you this point. 47-48.
Yeah.
That is the ultimate slap in the face.
Yes.
And the Palestinian people rightly have never gotten over that.
That's right.
Understood.
Yes.
But now we're talking generations and generations removed from that. And by now it's ingrained in the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. I understand why they feel the way they feel, but they feel the way they feel. And majorities don't believe Israel has a right to exist, and the majorities support acts of terror.
That's not true.
And so now
That's
it's
not
on
true.
them. How
That's
do we
not
get
true.
around that?
That's
Go
not
ahead.
true. That's absolutely not true. The majority of them do not want to wipe Israel off the map. The majority of them do not. They do not. Poll after poll that's been taken during the period when the Oslo Accords were happening, when peace negotiations were taking place, the majority of them had always wanted a peaceful negotiation in which you ended up with two states.
Who do you think, Farid, who has been a more honest broker? Israel screwed the Palestinians in 47-48. I'll give you that. But in the last 75 years, who's tried to do the whole two-state thing better than? To me, Israel's generally tried much better than the Palestinians have.
No, and that has not.
They've been in a position of power. I'll give you that.
Not the case. Not the case.
No.
That as you know, and you can look at sort of the history of Benjamin Netanyahu. That Benjamin Netanyahu has.
For the record, Farid's starting to piss me off, but this is such a fun conversation. Go ahead.
Benjamin
Farid.
Netanyahu staked his popularity in coming to power precisely because he was against the two-state solution. He said, I will do everything in my power to make sure the two-state solution does not happen. That's why, in fact, because keep in mind, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, he was assassinated, and guess who they blamed? They blamed Benjamin Netanyahu because they said he was the one who instigated the animosity against the two-state solution.
Okay, would you agree, Farid? Because you and I will disagree on that point, but would you agree that there's been pressure over the years from both of their extremist flanks not to achieve peace?
Absolutely.
Wouldn't you say that's been on both sides?
Absolutely. And that's the point.
Okay.
There's extremists on both sides. Just as you're saying that there's Palestinians that do not want Israel to exist. Absolutely. There are Palestinians that do not want Israel to exist. There are Palestinians that would love to get Israel to be wiped off the map. There are Palestinians who would love nothing more than to go back to 1948 or even before that, and they'd say, we want 100% of this land. There are Palestinians like that, but that had always been the minority. Just as, for instance, among Israelis, there are a segment of Israeli populations that want everything from the river to the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, the Likud party's actual a manifesto, their actual statement says that we shall have sovereignty for all of the land between the sea and the river, which is the Jordan River. And therefore, this is the Likud party's actual statement, and therefore they want all of it. Not to mention, of course, settlers or evangelical Christians and other Zionists, for instance, we could talk about, which won't give up an inch of territory. So when we talk about exterminating the other side, there's far more support among Israeli right and staunch supporters of evangelical Christians of trying to wipe out the Palestinians from this territory than there is among Palestinians wanting to eliminate Israel as a state.
Time out. I want to make sure I understand you, my friend.
Yes.
you think there's a greater percentage of Israelis that don't believe the Palestinians have a right to exist than there is Palestinians who don't believe Israel has a right to exist.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
and just for the record, I love you, and this is so much fun.
Yeah.
I completely disagree on that. Completely.
You know why I say I disagree with you? Is because the current government, the actual government, part of the cabinet of Benjamin Netanyahu, are openly saying it and have been saying it for decades. And therefore, that's a large segment, not to mention the majority of settlers. If you sit down and talk to settlers, they will speak just like Hamas does. And therefore, their views of what should happen is we should not give. They say, in fact, they don't even call it Palestine. What do they call it? They call it Judea and Samaria. They use biblical terms. They say this is Judea and Samaria, and we don't see any Palestinians. This is all to be given, and should be part of greater Israel. Not even Israel, but greater Israel, which includes, in fact, part of the land on the other side of the river, including parts of Jordan. That should be greater Israel. So for them, it's not only do they want all of the land between the river and the sea, they want land on the other side as well.
That's just, this is fascinating. And again, I really do appreciate this because I couldn't disagree stronger with you, but it's fascinating to get your perspective.
Yeah.
Because you and I know, I mean, Hamas is the governing party of Gaza. It's been in their charter.
Yeah.
The Palestinian Authority, man, it's in and out of their charter.
Yeah.
So I think there's a much greater percentage of Palestinians that don't believe Israel has a right to exist.
Today,
but that's fascinating.
Today, as I said.
Oh, I think it's all.
Today, what's
I'd
happening
say Israel's
is
a reaction to.
But
I'd say Israel's right is a reaction to the Palestinians from, like, Farid, and God, I could go on with you for 10 hours. But I want to get, and I really do appreciate this.
I appreciate this conversation. I think it's a healthy conversation. More Americans need to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
By the way,
I commend
you're not
you.
only an
I commend
expert.
you for having this, the guts to have this and have an open conversation. The fact that we're smiling and laughing about it, despite the fact it's so painful to see, because we're trying to say, look, this is difficult, but yet still, even you and I, when we disagree, we can somehow have a meaningful conversation about this in a way that we learn from each other and let those listening to learn from it as well.
Agreed. And not only are you an expert, I love the fact that you're so passionate. I mean that. I want to close, and we'll continue this, but I want to close with where I teased you at the beginning.
Yeah.
In that I think this conflict is really, really simple. I think both extremes try to complicate it. I've always, and I'll give you the final word because you're going to slap me, but I'll give you the final word. I have always adhered to what a variation what Golda Meir said. Yeah. What's the problem in the Middle East? How do you fix it? I've always believed that if Hamas and the Palestinians and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and the PA, and if the Palestinians laid down their arms tomorrow, there'd be peace, and said Israel has a right to exist, there'd be peace tomorrow. I believe if Israel laid down her arms tomorrow, I don't think there would be any more Israel tomorrow. I think the Middle East could be solved in a nanosecond if the Palestinians said, you got a right to exist, we're done with terrorism, let's do it. I'll give you the final word.
Well, thank you for that. Palestinians have for decades said that we want peace. For decades have said, if you give us 22% of our historic land and give us the West Bank and Gaza, we will stop fighting and we will not resort to armed resistance against Israel. That's what they want. The international community has supported that. All the Arab countries, keep in mind, 2002, the Arab peace agreement was offered by the Arab states, and Palestinians accepted that. They've always said, give us back 22%
And by the way,
of our history.
Farid, in 2000, Bill Clinton, I mean, Arafat was given more than 22% of the.
No, he was never.
And he walked away from it.
No.
I mean, Bill Clinton still screams.
No.
Oslo, same thing.
But if he was offered 22%, it would have meant that he would have been off. How could you say more when the entire West Bank and Gaza is 22%? He was never offered more than that. When you say
he was offered more than that, and he was given a generous deal on Jerusalem. But hey, Farid, let me ask you a question.
He was never offered more than 22%. 22% is the West Bank and Gaza is 22%. What was offered was in fact about 93% of the 22%, and therefore,
and Israel left Gaza.
Yeah.
And Hamas then took over Gaza. You'd agree with that. Israel leaves Gaza.
Yeah.
Hamas takes over. And immediately Hamas starts doing their thing. So Egypt and Israel put a blockade on Gaza. We're not going to revisit that history. But answer this, Farid.
Yeah.
If Israel said, okay, Hamas, I don't care who runs Gaza. Gaza is yours. We're done. No blockade, no nothing. It's your sovereign country. Whoever's going to rule it. If Israel walked away like that completely, what would happen in Gaza?
They would have to do the same in the West Bank. They couldn't just do it in Gaza. They would have to do both because Palestinians are one people. They want one unified state. The West Bank Palestinians want to be part of Gaza. Gaza Palestinians want to be part of the West Bank. They want this as one unified state. If Israel, when you asked in terms of if they put their arms down, would it lead to peace? In fact, if Israelis said you can have 22% of the historic land in which it includes the West Bank and Gaza, there would be peace tomorrow. It would be instantly the case. Clearly, there would be extremists. There would be some extremists that would say, no, we in fact want to go back to 1948, or we want to go even prior to that. There would be extremists, but I'm saying that would be a minority. It would diminish the support for Hamas. So when you ask what in fact I would advise to Benjamin Netanyahu, I would say the thing to say to Benjamin Netanyahu is offer the 67 borders, offer West Bank and Gaza, let Palestinians have freedom
Israel's security.
That in itself would provide security, because what would happen is, as I said, Hamas's support would dramatically diminish. And if that happens, you would end up with a two-state solution, and you'd end up with a peace agreement between the two. The Arabs would support it, the international community would support it, most Americans would support it, and people like me who've been saying it for 20 years, we would fully support it, because that's what we wanted.
You think if Israel laid down her arms tomorrow,
it would be over? It would
Palestinian
be over.
people
it would
through
be
Hamas
over.
or whatever,
it would be
there
over.
would be peace.
Absolutely would be peace. Absolutely would be peace. That would be the end of the conflict.
I think you're smoking something, my
it would be
college
totally
professor
over.
friend.
I've never smoked, so I wouldn't be smoking anything.
I'm gonna close with this. I'm gonna criticize Israel, and I want you to close with a criticism of your side. I think Israel's been arrogant, and they've taken much too much. And I think every time the Palestinians have engaged in terror, Israel has responded without thinking things through. Give me your biggest criticism of the Palestinian side throughout the last 75 years.
That Palestinians have resorted to violence. Absolutely a mistake. Absolutely a mistake. They should have never resorted to violence, and especially indiscriminate violence against innocent civilians.
Well,
absolutely.
Terror is the tool of the weak.
Yes, but what they should have always done and always insisted on, to say, we want freedom, equality, self-determination, the right to dictate our future. That's something that every American can get behind. We as freedom-loving Americans, I mean, whether it's conservative or liberal, everyone believes that people should have freedom, the people should have equality, people should have the right to self-determine their future. That's what Palestinians should have always insisted on. That's the only thing they should rally behind. And guess what? The globe and the world will rally behind them. They will get so much support among everyone, including the majority of Americans. without resorting to violence. That was their biggest mistake, and that continues to be their biggest mistake. If they do that, they will, in fact, in the end, have their freedom. They will have their self-determination, and that will be the outcome for Palestinians.
Why,
if they
then maybe this is a bad question. Why then, when Israel left Gaza in 2005, why didn't at least the Palestinians in Gaza choose
because
freedom
they did not,
and tolerance and prosperity?
Because they were never given freedom. They were never given sovereignty. They were never given independence. It was always a prison. It was always fully controlled. Everything going in and out is
Wasn't
a blockade by
Farid,
Israel.
wasn't
Literally,
wasn't
chocolate.
a big part of that?
Even
Go ahead.
chocolate. You couldn't look. Not only was everything controlled by what went in and out, Israel could turn it off. That's why they could turn off the water if they wanted. They could turn off the electricity if they wanted. They could turn off food. Do you know there was a calorie count against Palestinians? That the calorie count was, they literally said, look, there's 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. They controlled the amount of calories that went in. Imagine having that much control over you as a population. Would you, Joe Walsh, sitting in any place, wherever you are, in Chicago or where you are, if somebody said, we're going to determine everything you consume, everything that you have, and you then have to somehow live with it and accept it, you would never have accepted it.
Yeah, but Farid, the problem is Israel leaves Gaza.
But they
Hold on,
didn't.
don't jump on me yet. Don't jump on me yet.
They didn't give freedom and independence. They fully blockaded it. They continued
They gave 95% of freedom and independence, and then the Palestinians elect a terrorist organization to run.
As I said, it's an open air prison. If you are in a prison and you're then told, you know what, you have freedom in the prison, how does one actually have freedom in a prison?
Don't you blame Hamas as every bit as much for it being an open air prison?
I blame them for having resorted to violence. Absolutely. I've always condemned their violence.
What about all the money all the money they were given over the years?
We can talk about that. Keep in mind that was a lot of it was provided by Qatar. Benjamin Netanyahu allowed for that money to come in. Part of his strategy was to divide and conquer the Palestinians. He wanted Hamas. If you talk about Benjamin Netanyahu wanted Hamas in place. And in fact, Israel was fully supporting Hamas because they saw the Palestinian Authority as the serious threat to them.
No doubt.
And therefore, you think about it, they're propping up Hamas. The billions of dollars that came from Qatar, Israel, because they had control, allowed for those billions to come in. So the point is that they wanted that. Plus, it allowed for Benjamin Netanyahu to always say, I can, of course, never allow for a two-state solution because look at Hamas. They're terrorists. And so therefore, it gave him an excuse to resort to that. So that's the point. So it was in his benefit for Hamas to exist.
Agreed, Farid. That's the dirty little secret about Israel and Netanyahu that most people don't realize.
Absolutely.
I would say, and this is really the final, and you can respond, and then we're done. The dirty little secret on the Arab Muslim side is that the rest of the Arab Muslim world doesn't give a shit about the Palestinians. We talk about Gaza being an open-air prison in the blockade. Well, Egypt played a part in that as well.
Absolutely.
Egypt, Jordan, these countries don't give a damn about the Palestinian people. They love the fact that the Palestinians are a pain in the butt to Israel. I think that's their dirty little secret.
Absolutely, I would not disagree, and I think that's a major problem. That basically many of them, they fought on support of the Palestinians, and there was a nationalist movement in support of the Palestinians. It was sort of the major ideology of Arab nationalism, going all the way back in the 50s and 40s, for instance, saying that Palestinian cause was our cause as Arabs, as those they're our brothers. We need to support them. The '67 war was fought because of that national connection and identity, but that waned over time. That waned to the point where, yes, increasingly many states said, no, you know what, we don't want to continue to support. And that's why you had this normalization relation. We didn't even talk about that. You had the UAE normalize relations with Israel. Right. You had Bahrain normalize relations. Saudi Arabia was on the brink of normalizing relations. So in many ways, Palestinians saw this as an opportunity to say, look, you cannot forget us. You cannot ignore us. In fact, we're going to be brought back on the front burner, that you can't put us on the side or back burner. We're going to be brought back in. And what did they do? They, in fact, achieved that. And so what they did was they got not only the Arab states that were normalizing relations to throw that off the table, and they said, okay, we're not going to normalize relations with Israel. And others then, the world then had basically sidelined the Palestinians, had ignored it, had forgotten about it. What's happened? Every single person now in the world is talking about Palestine. Everyone's talking about it. My students across the United States, people who never were even understood or motivated by this, now are
they
like,
still don't
you know what?
understand.
They
And
don't
it'll go
understand it,
away.
but they want to know about it. Do you know how many talks I've given like this in the past 2.5 months? Probably 30 of them, because there's this constant interest. I thought this was an interesting topic for 25 years. Nobody else thought it was interesting. But now in the last 2.5 months, everybody wants to know about this conflict. Everybody wants to know about this discussion. It's because the world has sort of woken up and said, wait, explain to me what happened on October 7th. Explain to me what this whole issue is between Israelis and Palestinians. And therefore the interest is there, the desire to know more about it. And that's why I'm giving these talks, and the world is sort of waking up to it. But it requires understanding the history. It understands the context. And therefore, then, with that understanding, we'd be in a better position then to provide better analysis and recommendations for those in government positions like Benjamin Netanyahu or the Biden administration and so on and so forth. We would then make a better ally and supporter. And this I'll end with, that if you as a listener, and you, Joe Walsh, as a strong, staunch supporter of Israel, if you want ultimately for Israel to survive, and you want Israel to succeed, and Israel to have its security, which most people want, including people who are supporters of Palestine, people want Israel to survive. You want Israel to survive. That the current approach is ultimately suicidal. And we didn't even get into the discussion of where do we go 10 years from now, 20 years from now. The current approach that Israel is using is suicide to Israel. It's ultimately going to be the dismantling of the Jewish and Israeli state, because the current trajectory is not going to lead to security for Israel. And therefore, those people that are listening to this podcast, if they're staunch supporters of Israel, they have to rethink how they support Israel in a way that ultimately secures this state's survival rather than leads to suicide, which it will if we continue in the current approach.
Appreciate that perspective. I disagree in this regard. I think Israel has to eliminate Hamas and all its neighboring terror groups. I think the moderate Arab Muslim world wants Israel to do this. I think the ultimate solution after this ugly war is going to be that moderate Arab Muslim world working with Israel to squelch all the extremist Islamists, not Islam, Muslims, but the Islamists who are just raising hell. Dr. Farid Senzai, you are just fantastic.
Love you
Professor
too, Joe.
at Santa Clara University. He's just wonderful. Thanks so much for taking some time.
Thank you, Joe. I really enjoyed it. Look forward to a continued conversation. I appreciate all you do on this front. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.